You can't decide. It's a simple choice, should be easy, but you've been staring at it for hours, days, maybe weeks. Should you take the job or stay where you are? End the relationship or give it another chance? Move to a new city or play it safe? And the longer you sit with it, the worse it gets. The options blur together. Your mind spins in circles. You make a decision, then immediately doubt it. You flip back and forth until you're exhausted, paralyzed, stuck. And you think it's because you're indecisive, weak, overthinking it. But here's what'll mess you up. That's not what's happening at all. You're not indecisive. You're at war. Right now, as you're trying to make this choice, there's a battle raging inside your mind. 3 armies fighting for control. Each one wants something different. Each one is convinced it's right, and they're tearing you apart in the process. Freud saw this pattern everywhere. Patients who couldn't make simple decisions, people frozen between options, unable to move forward, unable to go back. Intelligent, capable people reduced to complete paralysis over choices that should have been straightforward. And when he started digging into what was really happening, when he mapped out the battlefield inside the human psyche, he discovered something that changes everything you think you know about decision-making. You're not choosing between options, you're choosing between parts of yourself. That job decision, it's not about salary versus stability, it's about which part of your psyche gets to win. That relationship choice, it's not about love versus logic. It's about which internal force gets to control your life. Every decision you make or can't make is the result of a conflict you don't even know is happening. And here's the really disturbing part. Most of the time, the war is already over before your conscious mind even gets involved. The battle happens in the dark. The winner is decided in your unconscious. And your rational mind? It just shows up after the fact to justify whichever side won. You think you're deliberating, weighing options, being thoughtful, but really, you're just watching a replay of a fight that already happened. And the armies doing the fighting, you don't even know their names. Freud did. He mapped them out. He identified the forces. He showed how they operate, what they want, and why they're locked in eternal combat. And the armies doing the fighting, you don't even know their names. Freud did. He mapped them out. He identified the forces. He showed how they operate, what they want, and why they're locked in eternal combat. Picture your mind as a battlefield. 3 forces locked in constant combat, each one fighting for dominance, each one convinced they know what's best for you. Freud gave them names: the id, the ego, and the superego. But forget the textbook definitions for a second. Let me show you what they actually are. The id is pure want, pure now. It's the part of you that sees what it desires and screams, "I need that immediately." No patience, no consideration for consequences, no concept of later, or maybe, or that's a bad idea. The id doesn't care if you can afford it, doesn't care if it'll hurt you tomorrow, doesn't care if it destroys everything you've built. It just wants, and it wants now. When you're staring at that decision, take the job, end the relationship, make the move, the id is screaming one thing: what feels good? What gives me pleasure? What satisfies the craving right now? It's the voice saying, quit your job, you hate it anyway. Chase the dream, do what makes you happy. Sounds liberating, right? Follow your bliss, live authentically. But the id doesn't think about rent, about responsibilities, about the fact that what feels good right now might destroy you in 6 months. That's not its job. The id's job is to want. That's it. Now meet the second army. The superego is the opposite. It's the internalized voice of every authority figure you've ever had. Your parents, your teachers, society, religion, every rule you've ever learned about what you should do. The superego doesn't care what you want. It cares about what's right, what's moral, what's acceptable, what people will think. When you're facing that same decision, the superego is screaming something completely different. You can't quit. That's irresponsible. What will people say? You have obligations, duty. You should be grateful for what you have. It's the voice of guilt, of shame, of who do you think you are to want more. The superego keeps you in line, keeps you acceptable, keeps you from stepping out of bounds. But it also keeps you small, keeps you trapped, keeps you living for everyone else's approval instead of your own life. And caught between these two screaming voices, the ego, the poor, exhausted, desperate ego. The ego is you, or what you think is you. It's your conscious, rational mind trying to navigate between the id's demands and the superego's judgments while also dealing with reality. The ego is the one actually trying to make the decision, trying to find a solution that satisfies the id's desires, meets the superego's standards, and doesn't get you killed in the process. It's an impossible job. The id screams, "Do it, now, what you want matters." The superego screams back, "Don't you dare, you'll regret it. Think of your responsibilities." And the ego is standing in the middle, getting torn apart, trying to make everyone happy, trying to find a compromise that doesn't exist. That's why you can't decide. Not because you're weak, not because you're overthinking it, because you're literally trying to satisfy three different masters with three completely incompatible agendas. And here's what makes this truly devastating. The conflict doesn't stay contained. It doesn't just make you indecisive. It actively sabotages you in ways you don't even recognize. You know what procrastination really is. It's not laziness. It's not poor time management. It's not a character flaw. It's a stalemate. When the id and the superego are locked in combat and neither side can win, the ego just freezes. It can't move forward because every option feels wrong. Every choice triggers one army or the other. You need to work on that project. The id says, "This is boring, do something fun." The superego says, "You should be working, you're wasting time." The ego tries to compromise and ends up scrolling social media for 3 hours, satisfying no one, hating itself. That's not avoidance, that's warfare. And it gets worse, because sometimes, when the conflict gets too intense, when the pressure from both sides becomes unbearable, the psyche does something truly twisted. It sabotages itself. Self-sabotage is what happens when one part of your psyche attacks another through you. You finally decide to take that job, make that move, start that relationship, the rational choice. The ego has made its decision, but the id didn't agree, or the superego didn't approve. So what happens? You oversleep on the interview day. You forget important documents. You pick a fight with your partner right before the commitment. You make a stupid mistake that ruins everything. And you think it's just bad luck, just you being careless. But Freud would tell you there are no accidents. There's no such thing as, "I don't know why I did that." You did it because part of you wanted to. The part that lost the internal battle found another way to win. It couldn't stop you consciously, so it sabotaged you unconsciously. And here's what's really going to disturb you. Sometimes you choose things you don't even want. You make decisions that go against everything you claim to value, and you can't explain why. Why do you stay in relationships that make you miserable? Why do you take jobs that drain your soul? Why do you keep making choices that lead to the same painful outcomes? Because different parts of you want different things. Your ego might want the relationship to end, but your superego says, "Good people don't give up. You made a commitment. What will everyone think?" So you stay, miserable, trapped, but doing the right thing. Or maybe your ego wants stability, wants to build something sustainable, but your ID is screaming for excitement, for novelty, for that dopamine hit of something new. So you blow it up, you cheat, you quit, you destroy what you built because the id couldn't tolerate boredom anymore. You're not making choices. You're just the battlefield where these forces fight. And the winner? It's not always the part of you that's actually in your best interest. Sometimes the id wins and you chase pleasure straight into disaster. Sometimes the superego wins, and you suffocate under the weight of others' expectations. Sometimes the ego wins, and you make the reasonable choice that satisfies no one and leaves you empty. But here's what Freud observed that's truly chilling. People can live their entire lives this way. Decades of decisions made by whichever internal force happened to be strongest in that moment. No consistency, no real agency. Just a lifetime of being pulled in 3 directions at once. And the cost? Anxiety. Constant, grinding anxiety, because part of you is always unsatisfied with whatever choice you make. Guilt. Deep, persistent guilt, because another part of you is always condemning you for it. Regret. Endless regret, because you keep choosing things you don't actually want, driven by forces you don't understand. Freud had a patient who embodied this perfectly, someone whose entire life was shaped by an internal war they couldn't see. And watching what happened to them reveals exactly how destructive this silent conflict becomes when it goes unresolved. His name was Ernst, a lawyer, brilliant mind, successful career, everything looked perfect from the outside. But Ernst couldn't make a single decision without agony. He'd been engaged to a woman for years, but he couldn't set a wedding date. Every time he got close, something inside him pulled back. Panic, doubt, a feeling he couldn't name. His rational mind, his ego, knew she was perfect for him. Supportive, intelligent, from a good family, everything he was supposed to want. But he couldn't do it. And it wasn't just the engagement, it was everything. He'd get promotions and then find ways to undermine his own success, start projects and abandon them right before completion, make plans and cancel at the last minute. His life was a pattern of starting and stopping, moving forward and pulling back, an endless loop of indecision and self-sabotage. When he came to Freud, he was desperate. "I don't understand what's wrong with me. Why can't I just choose and move forward like everyone else?" And Freud started digging. What he found was a war zone. Ernst's father had been controlling, demanding, obsessed with status and appearances. The superego had been trained early. You must succeed. You must make the right choices. You must never fail or disappoint. So Ernst built a life according to those rules. The career, the respectable fiancé, the perfect image. But underneath, his id was screaming. Because Ernst didn't actually want any of it. Not the career he'd been pushed into, not the woman his family approved of, not the life that looked good on paper. He wanted to paint, to travel, to live messily and freely and without the weight of constant judgment. But that desire was so unacceptable to his internalized father, to his superego, that he couldn't even consciously acknowledge it. So instead, he just froze. The id pulled one way. Run, be free. This isn't your life. The superego pulled the other. You can't abandon your responsibilities. What kind of man walks away from success? From a good woman, you'll be a disgrace. And the ego, stuck in the middle, paralyzed, unable to choose either path because both felt like death. So he chose neither. He stayed engaged but never married, kept the career but sabotaged his advancement, lived in permanent limbo, satisfying no one, least of all himself. And the cost? He developed crippling anxiety, insomnia, physical symptoms, stomach problems, tension headaches. His body was manifesting the war his mind wouldn't acknowledge. Freud worked with him for months, slowly uncovering the conflict, making the unconscious conscious, helping him see that his indecision wasn't weakness, it was a rational response to an impossible situation. You can't serve two masters. You can't live for your father's approval and your own authenticity. You can't satisfy the superego's demands and the id's desires simultaneously. Something has to give. And for Ernst, the breaking point came when Freud asked him one simple question. If your father were dead and no one was watching and there would be no consequences, what would you choose? The answer came immediately, without hesitation. He'd leave everything, the job, the engagement, the whole life. That's when Ernst realized he'd been living someone else's life. The superego had won so completely that he couldn't even see his own desires anymore. And once he saw it, once the conflict became conscious, everything changed. Not easily, not without pain, but he made a choice. A real choice, not dictated by the id's impulses or the superego's rules, but by his actual self finally having a voice. He ended the engagement, left the law firm, moved to Paris and painted. Some people called it a breakdown. His family certainly did. But Freud called it integration, the resolution of an internal war. And that's the key insight here. You can't resolve these conflicts by accident. You can't stumble into peace. The war will rage whether you acknowledge it or not. The only way out is to make it conscious. So here you are, stuck in your own war, unable to decide, sabotaging yourself, living a life that doesn't feel like yours. What do? Here's what won't work. Trying to think it through rationally. Because your rational mind, your ego, is already exhausted from trying to mediate. It doesn't have the power to end the war. It's just caught in the crossfire. What also won't work? Ignoring it. Hoping the conflict will resolve itself, because it won't. The id and superego will keep fighting for control, and you'll keep being torn apart in the middle. So what does work? Freud's answer was radical for his time, and it's still radical now. Make the conflict conscious. Stop pretending you're just weighing options. Stop telling yourself you're being thoughtful or careful. Name what's actually happening. Next time you're paralyzed by a decision, ask yourself 3 questions. 1. What does the id want? Not what sounds reasonable. Not what you should want. What does the primitive, impulsive part of you actually crave? Maybe it's freedom. Maybe it's pleasure. Maybe it's revenge. Maybe it's escape. Don't judge it. Just name it. 2. What does the superego demand? What's the voice of guilt saying? What's the internalized parent, the societal expectation, the moral judgment telling you that you should do? Maybe it's duty. Maybe it's sacrifice. Maybe it's staying small to keep others comfortable. Again, don't judge it. Just identify it. 3. What does the ego actually need? Strip away the ED's impulses and the superego's rules. What are you, the person trying to survive, trying to build a life, trying to be okay? What do you actually need? Not want, not should, need. Sometimes the answer is stability. Sometimes it's change. Sometimes it's rest. Sometimes it's risk. But you can't know until you separate your voice from the other two. And here's what happens when you do this consciously. The paralysis starts to break. Not because the conflict goes away. It doesn't. The id and superego don't suddenly agree. But you stop being unconsciously controlled by whichever force is loudest. You can look at the id's demand and say, I hear you. I know what you want. But no, we're not doing that because it would destroy us. You can look at the superego's judgment and say, I hear you too. I know you're afraid of what people will think, but we're not living for their approval anymore. And then you can make a real choice, not a compromise that satisfies no one, not a surrender to whichever army is winning, a conscious decision from your actual self. Ernst did this. Once he could see the war clearly, once he could separate his father's voice from his own desires, from what he actually needed, he could finally choose. And yeah, the choice was painful. The superego screamed guilt at him for months. The id wanted him to burn everything down immediately. But the ego, finally with space to breathe, made a decision that was his own. That's the goal. Not to kill the id or silence the superego. You can't. They're part of being human. The goal is to see them clearly, to recognize when they're fighting, to understand what each one wants, and then to choose consciously instead of being unconsciously controlled. Because here's the truth Freud understood. You're going to make decisions your whole life. Thousands of them, big ones, small ones, life-changing ones, and every single one will involve this conflict. The question isn't whether the war exists. It does. It always will. The question is, are you going to be a conscious participant in your own decisions, or are you going to keep being the battlefield, torn apart by forces you refuse to see? So if this video just revealed the invisible war that's been controlling your choices, if you're sitting there realizing how many decisions weren't actually yours, you need to understand something. This conflict doesn't just shape your decisions, it shapes your entire personality. The person you think you are, that's just the ego's best attempt to reconcile the war. And in the next video, I'm going to show you exactly how this internal conflict creates the masks you wear, the roles you play, and the person you pretend to be, even to yourself. Don't miss it.